She was just a girl applying for a job. Her hands trembled, her resume was crumpled, her eyes were downcast, a habit she'd long since grown. But in the meeting room of the city's biggest criminal empire, where a nod could wipe out an entire family, she spilled coffee on Dante Ravenna's confidential documents. And when he grabbed her by the collar, he saw the bruises. No one expected that moment to shake the entire city. Welcome to my story. If you want to see how far this story has come, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with the city you're currently viewing. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will keep you glued to the screen. The rain started before dawn and never quit. By the time Kayla Voss stepped off the bus on Vantage Street, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and the gutters were running black with whatever the city flushed down its drains at night. She had one umbrella, broken at the third rib so it listed hard to the left. She held it anyway. The folder tucked under her arm, resume, 2 letters of reference, a photocopy of her accounting certificate, had started to soften at the edges. She pressed her elbow tighter against it and kept walking. Blackthorn Tower rose at the end of the block like something that had always been there and always would be. 42 floors of black-tinted glass and reinforced steel, no logos on the facade, no decorative lighting, just the building, just its weight. The kind of structure that didn't need to announce itself because everything in the city already understood what it was. Kayla stopped at the corner and looked up at it. Her reflection looked back from the glass, small, damp, holding a ruined umbrella. And she made herself breathe through her nose the way the therapist she could no longer afford had taught her. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She'd been unemployed for 11 weeks. Rent was 42 days past due. Her stepbrother had loaned her $600 with the kind of quiet that meant he couldn't do it again. And this job, personal executive secretary to the head of Ravenna Holdings, the company that officially owned 3 luxury hotel chains, a private port authority, and half the commercial real estate south of the river, paid 4 times what any other offer on her list was worth. Unofficially, everyone in the city knew what Ravenna Holdings was, what it was connected to, who it answered to. She had told herself it didn't matter. She walked through the front doors. The lobby was cold and immaculate. White marble floors that reflected the overhead lights like a shallow pool. A security desk staffed by 2 men built like refrigerators who didn't smile when she approached. She gave her name. One of them made a call without looking at her. The other handed her a visitor badge that was the color of ash and told her to clip it to her lapel. She did. A woman in a charcoal suit appeared from behind the elevator bank. 40-ish, close-cropped hair, reading glasses hanging from a lanyard around her neck. She extended her hand without introducing herself and said, "You're the 9 o'clock, come on." "I'm Kayla. I know who you are." The woman was already walking. "Don't use his first name. Don't speak unless you're spoken to in the first meeting. Don't touch anything on his desk. If he asks your opinion, he doesn't actually want it. He wants to see how you handle being put on the spot. Give a clear, short answer and stop talking." Kayla followed her into the elevator. The doors closed. "Don't apologize for things that aren't your fault," the woman continued. "But if something goes wrong on your watch, own it immediately. Don't deflect, don't make excuses, and don't cry. He doesn't respect crying. He doesn't respect weakness of any kind." "What does he respect?" The woman looked at her for the first time. There was something careful in her expression, like she was measuring the question. "Speed, precision. People who don't waste his time. People who can look at a hard thing and deal with it instead of looking away." She paused. "Are you any of those things?" "I can be." The woman's expression didn't change. "That's the wrong answer. You either are or you aren't." The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a hallway with no art on the walls and no ambient noise except for the faint vibration of rain against the building's north side. "My name is Petra. I've been his chief of staff for 9 years. The last secretary lasted 18 days. The one before her lasted 4. What happened to them?" "They quit." "In that order." Petra started walking again. "You were selected because your background check came back the cleanest of anyone we interviewed, because you have no social media presence worth mentioning, and because your accounting background means you can work with numbers without asking questions about where they come from." Kayla's stomach tightened. She kept her face neutral. "The meeting you're walking into," Petra said, pushing open a door at the end of the hallway, "is already in progress. You'll be serving coffee. The tray is on the credenza inside. Keep your eyes down, keep your movements small, and do not, under any circumstances, interrupt what's happening. Okay? I mean it. I understand. Petra held the door open. Kayla walked through it. The conference room was long and dim. Floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides gave onto the gray sprawl of the city below, rain sheeting down the glass in wide curves. The table was dark wood, polished to a mirror finish, and 8 men sat around it. Suits, silence, papers fanned out between them like playing cards. At the far end of the table, a man stood with his back to her, looking out the window at the city. He was tall, wide in the shoulders, dark hair cut close at the sides. He wore a shirt the color of charcoal, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had both hands in his pockets and he was completely still, the way certain predators are still. Not relaxed, but coiled. Nobody looked at Kayla. Nobody acknowledged her. She moved to the credenza, found the tray with the carafe and cups exactly where Petra had said it would be, and started pouring. She was halfway down the table when she heard the man at the window speak. "You're telling me the Meridian permits have been delayed because of one signature." His voice was low and flat, the kind of voice that didn't need volume. "One man." "Councilman Farrow," said one of the seated men. "He's been unresponsive since Tuesday. His assistant says he's reviewing the environmental—" "I know what his assistant says." The man at the window still hadn't turned around. "What I'm asking is why that's still the excuse you're bringing to me on a Thursday morning." Nobody answered. Kayla kept moving down the table, careful, measured. She set a cup in front of the man at her left, then the man at his left, then reached across to the empty space at the head of the table. The carafe was heavier than she'd expected. Her right hand trembled slightly. It had been doing that for weeks, since the last bad night, since the last time Richard had... She pressed the heel of her palm harder against the handle and poured. The man at the window turned around. She didn't look up. She focused on the cup, on the dark stream of liquid, on keeping her hands level. "The Farrow issue will be handled by Monday," he said, starting to walk toward his chair. "If it isn't, I want a full accounting of every public contract his district office has touched in the last 3 years. People in glass houses, gentlemen." He pulled out his chair. "Which brings us to the Vantage Street development. Marchetti." The man 2 seats from the head of the table opened a folder. Kayla moved to place the last cup, the one at the head of the table, directly in front of the man now sitting down. She leaned forward. The carafe's spout tilted. She adjusted her grip. Her wrist buckled. The carafe went sideways. Hot coffee poured across the document spread on Dante Ravenna's side of the table in a wide, steaming arc. The room stopped. Not quiet. Stopped. Like something had been cut. Every man at that table went rigid. The sound of the rain against the glass seemed suddenly very loud. Kayla stood there with the carafe in her hand and the spreading stain in front of her, and she felt the specific, terrible sensation of her body, understanding danger before her mind had finished processing what had happened. Her face went cold. Her knees were doing something she couldn't afford to let them do. "I'm sorry." The words came out immediately, without thought. "I'm so sorry, that was... I'll get it. I have..." She was already reaching for the napkin on the tray, pressing it against the documents, trying to stop the spread. "I'm so sorry." The man at the head of the table hadn't moved. She finally looked up. Dante Ravenna was watching her. He was in his mid-30s, with a face that had been arranged by nature into something that would have been handsome if it weren't so unreadable. Dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had taken its share of hits, a faint scar along the left side of his chin that nobody had mentioned and probably nobody would dare to. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't parse. Not quite anger, not quite anything she had a name for. And the stillness of it was more frightening than shouting would have been. The 8 men at the table were watching him, watching to see what he would do. Kayla pressed the napkin harder against the documents and kept her eyes on the table. She could hear her own pulse. "Leave it." His voice came from directly above her. She hadn't heard him stand. She looked up and he was there, much closer than she'd expected, 2 feet of space between them that felt like 2 inches, and she stepped back automatically. Pure instinct. The same reflex she'd developed over 3 years of learning to read a room and position herself near exits. Dante noticed. She saw it, the slight shift of his gaze, tracking her movement and its cause. She made herself stop moving. I said, leave it. He reached past her and pulled the documents from under the napkin, flipped them face down. His eyes moved to hers. Name. Kayla. Kayla Voss. I'm the... Petra told me to come up and serve. I know who you are. His voice was the same flat temperature it had been throughout the entire meeting. You're trembling. She couldn't argue with that. I apologize. I know that's not... I didn't ask for an apology. He was still looking at her in that measuring way. I asked why you're trembling. Those are different questions. In her peripheral vision, she could see the 8 men at the table watching this exchange with the complete attention of people who understood that something important was being decided, even if they couldn't identify what it was. I'm nervous, she said. First day. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth. Dante looked at her for another moment. Then he reached out and took hold of the collar of her blouse. Not roughly, but not gently either. The grip of someone doing something deliberate, and pulled the fabric a half-inch to the side. She froze. He wasn't looking at the spilled coffee. He was looking at her neck. The bruise there was 4 days old, which meant it had gone from purple to the specific yellow-green of something healing wrong. She'd covered it with concealer that morning and hadn't thought about how the heat and the humidity from the elevator might have shifted the coverage. She thought about it now, too late, with Dante Ravenna's hand at her collar and 8 armed men sitting 12 feet away. He let go of the fabric. He didn't say anything immediately. He turned to the room, and when he spoke, his voice had the same controlled flatness it always seemed to carry, but underneath it, barely underneath it, was something with an edge that hadn't been there before. We're done for this morning, he said. Marchetti, have the Vantage Street projections on my desk by 2. Everyone else, out. Nobody argued. Nobody asked questions. 8 men in expensive suits gathered their papers and moved toward the door with a speed that communicated very clearly that they understood this wasn't optional. Petra appeared in the doorway. Dante looked at her once, and she withdrew. The door closed. Kayla was alone in the conference room with Dante Ravenna, a spreading coffee stain on his table, and the sound of rain. She didn't move. He walked to the window, hands back in his pockets, and looked at the city the same way he'd been looking at it when she'd walked in. She watched his shoulders and waited because everything in her body was telling her not to speak, not to move, not to give him any reason to turn around. He turned around. How long? I'm sorry? The bruise. His voice was still flat, still controlled, but his eyes weren't. How long? She opened her mouth to tell him she'd walked into a doorframe. She had the story ready. She always had it ready, the way people who live in certain kinds of houses develop certain kinds of reflexes. She opened her mouth. She said nothing. Something in the way he was looking at her made the automatic lies stop in her throat. Not pity. She would have managed pity. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with the cold, analytical attention of a man doing a calculation. And the thing about that expression was that it was too similar to her own internal voice, the one she'd been ignoring for 3 years, the one that knew. A few weeks, she said. It came out quiet. He nodded. Once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Who? Not a question, a direction. That's not... She stopped, started again. It's not something that affects this job. I'm here to work. I can handle the work. What happened with the coffee was... I didn't ask about the coffee. He moved away from the window, crossed to the far side of the room, and stood with his back against the wall, the way men who operate in his world sometimes stand. Walls to the back, angles covered, the kind of spatial positioning that becomes muscle memory when the alternative is a bullet between the shoulders. You came into this building today needing a job badly enough to take this one. That tells me something about your situation. His gaze moved to her neck again briefly. That tells me the rest. Kayla looked at him. What exactly do you think you know? I think someone hurts you regularly. I think you've gotten good at hiding it, which means it's been going on long enough to learn from. I think you're scared of me right now, but I'm not the primary source of fear in your life, which means whoever is doing that to you ranks higher on that scale Then a man with my reputation. That's relevant information. The accuracy of it landed somewhere behind her sternum. She kept her face level. The job is still available, he said. You'll be given a contract this afternoon. Standard terms. Petra will walk you through. You start Monday. She blinked. That's it? That's it. You're not going to ask more questions? I just told you what I already know. Questions are for filling gaps. He moved toward the door. One thing. She waited. He paused with his hand on the door, and when he looked back at her, something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was more like the shadow of a decision being made. The man who left those marks on you, he said. His name. Her pulse jumped. Why? Because I'm going to learn it regardless. You can save us both time. You have no business. I have whatever business I decide I have. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of geometry, the same way you'd say the floor is level. His name, Ms. Voss. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was still hitting the windows. Outside, the city went about its business, 42 floors below, indifferent to the conversation happening above it. Keller, she said finally, and hated herself a little for saying it. Richard Keller. The name didn't visibly affect him. He nodded. He opened the door. He walked out. Kayla stood alone in the conference room with her broken folder and her coffee-stained nerves and the slowly cooling spill on the table, and she replayed the last 4 minutes in her head, trying to understand what had just happened. She'd come in to serve coffee and survive a first impression. Instead, she'd given a man who ran the underside of this city her boyfriend's name. And what frightened her most, standing alone in that room with the rain running down the glass, wasn't what Dante Ravenna might do with that information. It was the relief she'd felt when she said it. Petra appeared in the doorway. Still breathing? She asked. Barely. Good. Petra held the door open. He hired you. Don't make me regret telling him you were qualified. She paused. And buy better concealer. Kayla picked up her tray. She walked back to the credenza. She set it down. Her hands, she noticed distantly, had stopped shaking. She wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a terrible one. Bas, 3 floors below, in his private office, Dante Ravenna sat at his desk and typed a name into a search field his IT department would never access. Richard Keller. The first page of results populated in under 2 seconds. Real estate developer, Keller Group Holdings, net worth estimated at $1.2 billion. Notable philanthropist, donor to 7 different city council campaigns, profiled twice in the city's Business Monthly, photographed at charity galas with a wide, easy smile. A man who had learned very early that a large enough public image cast a shadow long enough to hide almost anything beneath. Dante read through the profile the way he read most things, without expression, without hurry. Somewhere in the building, a new employee was walking toward the elevator with a ruined umbrella and 3 years of damage she'd gotten good at carrying. He closed the first search page, opened a second one. He had work to do. And now, without entirely meaning to, Kayla Voss had just handed the most dangerous man in the city a reason to do it. The contract arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon, delivered by a woman who wasn't Petra and who didn't introduce herself, slid across the surface of a desk that Kayla had been assigned in a glass-walled office 1 floor below the executive level. The desk was clean, the chair adjusted to a height that suggested someone had measured for it, and a laptop had been set up and logged into a generic profile with her name already typed into the username field. None of this felt accidental. All of it felt like a demonstration. She read the contract twice. The salary made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The confidentiality clauses were 17 pages long and written in language that an entertainment lawyer couldn't parse without a second opinion. She signed where the tabs indicated and handed it back without comment. By 5 o'clock, Petra appeared and gave her a 40-minute orientation that was really a series of rules delivered at the pace of someone who had given them many times and had stopped believing any of it would fully stick. Dante's schedule, she was told, did not exist on any networked calendar. Kayla would receive a printed copy each morning, hand-delivered, which she would memorize and then shred. She would screen calls through a landline on her desk and forward only what passed a list of criteria Petra would email her, She would never confirm or deny that Dante was in the building to anyone she didn't recognize by face. She would not discuss anything she heard in any meeting, ever, with anyone, including people who worked in the same building. "What about the cleaning staff?" Kayla asked. Petra looked at her. "What about them?" "If one of them asked me how my day was, is that a confidentiality violation?" A pause. Something shifted at the edge of Petra's expression that might have been the preliminary stages of respect. "No, but don't make friends here. It's not that kind of place." Kayla said she understood. She did not take the bus home. She had learned 3 years ago to vary her route. It was one of those adjustments that had crept into her life so gradually she barely remembered installing it, like the habit of sitting with her back to the wall in restaurants, or the reflex of checking the parking lot before she walked to her car. Small erosions, each one rational at the time. Added together, a map of everything she'd quietly surrendered. She took a cab and had it drop her 2 blocks from her apartment building and walked the rest through the rain with her broken umbrella. The apartment was the same as she'd left it, tidy. A specific kind of tidy that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with control. The one area of her life where the disorder hadn't reached yet. She locked the deadbolt, then the chain, then stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the door and her eyes on the middle distance. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. She could see the name from across the room. Richard. She let it ring. It rang again 11 minutes later. She let that one go too. At 9:40, a text. "Where are you?" "I came by." At 9:53, Kayla. At 10:16, "Answer your phone or I'm coming back." She turned the screen face down, took a long shower with the water hotter than was comfortable, and went to bed. She lay there in the dark and did the breathing exercise that she'd once believed would eventually become automatic. It hadn't. She still had to count. She still had to work at it. She thought about the look on Dante Ravenna's face when he'd said his name. She thought about Richard's smile in the business monthly profile, the wide, easy smile he'd shown her in the beginning, before she'd learned what it meant when that smile went flat. She closed her eyes and slept poorly and woke up at 5:47 to a notification she didn't want to read. Monday started before 7, which she hadn't expected, and by 7:20 she was at her desk with a printed schedule in front of her and a coffee she'd made herself from the machine in the small kitchen 2 doors down. The schedule listed 9 items. 3 of them had no descriptions, only times. That was the part she had to get used to. The gaps, the unspecified blocks, the understanding that not everything would be explained to her, and that the correct response to that was not to ask. At 7:55, Dante walked past her office without stopping. He glanced at her through the glass. She held up the schedule to indicate she had it. He kept walking. At 8:10, Petra appeared. He wants the Meridian file summary on his desk before the 9 o'clock. The hard copies are in the archive room, 3rd cabinet from the left, drawer marked MDev current. Don't take the originals. There's a copier in the room. Use that. Kayla was already standing. Any specific pages? All of them. He'll tell you which ones he doesn't need after he's looked. She had the summary on his desk by 8:40. He was on the phone when she placed it there, standing at his window again, and he didn't look at her, but he reached out and pulled the folder toward him with 2 fingers while still talking, and she understood that to be acknowledgement enough. By Wednesday, she had started to map the rhythm of the place. Who answered to whom? Which lieutenants came and went through the side entrance? Which meetings happened off schedule, and which ones she was expected to prepare for versus which ones she wasn't told about in advance by design. She filed the things she wasn't supposed to notice into a part of her mind she didn't visit out loud, and she did her work. And she was precise about it, and nobody spoke to her unless they needed something. On Thursday afternoon, she was in the archive room when she heard 2 of Dante's men talking in the hallway. She wasn't trying to listen. She was standing at the copier with a stack of permits, and the machine was loud enough that she shouldn't have been able to catch anything. But the copier finished its cycle between sentences, and in the gap she heard, Keller's people were asking questions about the new hire, trying to get her employment record. And then the copier started again, and she lost the rest. She stood in front of the machine for an extended moment with the permits in her hand. Richard had resources. She'd always known that. She'd just spent 3 years convincing herself his resources were pointed elsewhere, at competitors, at deals, at the city contracts he cultivated with the careful attention of a gardener who understood that the soil mattered more than the flowers. She'd told herself she wasn't important enough to investigate. She told herself a lot of things about herself that had turned out to be comfortable rather than true. She brought the permits to her desk and sat down and looked at her phone. No new messages. That was its own kind of message. Richard's silences had a texture to them. She'd become fluent in the difference between the silence that meant he was busy and the silence that meant he was thinking. She had been working for Ravenna Holdings for 4 days. He had already started asking questions. She opened her laptop and checked the afternoon schedule and kept working. The confrontation she'd been anticipating came on Friday. Not from Richard, from Petra. It was 3:30 when Petra walked into her office and closed the door, which she had never done before, and stood in front of Kayla's desk with her arms crossed and her reading glasses up on her forehead, and said, "I need to know whether you disclosed anything about this organization to Richard Keller." Kayla's hands went still on her keyboard. "I've been here less than a week." "That's not an answer." "No, I haven't disclosed anything. I've barely spoken to him since I started." "But you have spoken to him." "He called me." "I didn't answer." She paused. "He called me 3 times Sunday night and sent texts. I didn't respond to any of them." Petra looked at her steadily. "We had a security alert Tuesday morning. Someone ran a query on this building's corporate filing records. The originating IP traces back to a server Keller Group Holdings uses for their legal division." "That's public record information," Kayla said carefully. "Anyone can run that query." "Yes, the timing is interesting, that's all." Petra's voice was neutral in a way that managed to convey judgment anyway. "Mr. Ravenna is aware of it. He doesn't believe you're the source. I want to confirm that independently." "Then you have your confirmation." Kayla held Petra's gaze. "I took this job because I needed one, not because Richard Keller told me to. He doesn't know I work here." A beat. "He'll find out," Petra said. "People like him always do." She left without closing the door. Kayla sat very still for a moment. Then she reached under her desk and retrieved her bag and took out her personal phone and looked at it with the careful attention of someone examining a problem they'd been putting off. She typed, "Don't contact me at this number during work hours." She stared at the message for a moment. Then she deleted it without sending. The truth, which she was too tired to dress up in something more manageable, was that she didn't know how to have the conversation that needed to happen. She'd been not having it for 3 years. The machinery of not having it had become so deeply embedded in how she moved through her days that she wasn't certain she could locate the starting point anymore. Every time she got close to the edge of it, something in her body did the math. His size, his money, his particular talent for making the version of events she carried around in her head feel like something she'd invented. And the edge moved. She put the phone away. She looked at her screen. She kept working. What? Saturday was her day off, which felt abstract after a week of operating at the pace of that building. She cleaned her apartment with the thoroughness of someone keeping herself occupied, went to the grocery store for the first time in 2 weeks, and came home to find Richard Keller sitting in his car across the street. He didn't get out immediately. He was in the Porsche, the dark gray one, driver's window down, watching her walk from the cab to her building entrance with an expression she knew well enough to feel before she could fully see it across the distance. It was the patient expression, the one that said he'd been waiting a while and had decided to make something of that. She stopped at the entrance and looked across at him. He got out of the car. He was tall and well-built and wore clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. And when he crossed the street toward her, he moved with the ease of a man who'd never been told he didn't belong somewhere. That confidence had been part of the original appeal. She remembered it. She'd told herself confidence was something she was attracted to before she'd understood the difference between confidence and the specific conviction that consequences were for other people. "You haven't returned my calls," he said. "I've been working." "You got a job." Something moved in his face. "Where?" "Administrative position downtown, accounting support." "Where downtown?" "Richard, it's a simple question." She looked at him. The grocery bag was in her left hand. She kept her right hand free because that was another one of those adjustments she'd installed so quietly she'd almost stopped noticing it. "I'm not going to do this out here," she said. "Then let's go inside." "No." He stopped. The patient expression tightened at the edges. "I'm sorry about last week," he said, and his voice shifted into the register she'd once called gentle and now identified more accurately as controlled. "I was out of line. I know that. There's been a lot of pressure on the Eastport deal, and I've been, Richard, I'm not making excuses. I know that's what it sounds like. I just want to talk. Come on." He reached out and touched her arm, just above the elbow, light pressure, the kind of touch that could be called affectionate, the kind that had a purpose under the affection. "Just come inside, 10 minutes. She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at his face. She should have said no then. She knew it. Some part of her was narrating the moment from a slight distance, the way it had learned to narrate difficult moments. Say no? Say no right now? This is the part where you say no. And she felt herself tipping towards something anyway, the old pull of not wanting to make the moment worse, of believing that managing him was safer than refusing him, which was a lie she'd been telling herself long enough that it had developed its own momentum. 10 minutes, she said. She would spend time later trying to identify what exactly had made her say that. She never quite found an answer that satisfied her. He was in her apartment for 40 minutes. The first 15 went the way they usually went after a bad incident. Careful, searching, the negotiation of tone between two people who'd learned each other's geography. He apologized twice more, and both apologies had the polished quality of something practiced. She sat in the chair by the window. He sat on the sofa. She kept the distance deliberate. He noticed and didn't comment on it, which was its own kind of commentary. Then she mentioned, without planning to, that she'd been busy this week. "New job," he said. "Yes. You could have told me you were interviewing. It happened quickly." "Where?" She looked at him. "I'd rather not get into specifics right now." The temperature in the room changed. Not loudly. It never happened loudly. That was the part people who hadn't experienced it didn't understand. The loudness came after. The transition was almost quiet. "Why would you rather not?" he said. "Because I'd like to have one part of my life that's mine." He stood up. She made herself stay in the chair. She kept her eyes on his face. "One part of your life that's yours," he repeated, and the careful voice was gone now, replaced by something she recognized, the way she recognized weather changes in her joints. "We've been together 3 years, and you want one part of your life that's yours, as if I've been taking something from you." "I didn't say that." "That's exactly what you said." He moved toward her, and her body did the math before she'd finished the calculation, and she stood because sitting put her at a physical disadvantage that she'd learned the hard way. He stopped, looked at her. "What's the company name?" "Richard?" "What is the company name?" "Stop." He crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 steps and grabbed her by the arm. Not the arm she'd kept free, the other one, the grocery-carrying one, which meant she'd made the wrong calculation. And his grip was the specific kind of hard that didn't leave much ambiguity about what it was. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, very quietly, and the quietness was the thing she feared most because it meant he'd already moved past the stage where anger could be redirected. "And I would strongly suggest—" She twisted her arm and pulled back. He pulled forward. She caught the edge of the kitchen counter on her way down and managed to turn it into a stumble rather than a fall, and she came up with her back against the counter and her heart slamming against the inside of her chest at a rate that made it hard to think clearly. He stood 3 feet away, looking at her. His face had gone through some transformation she didn't have a word for, something that looked, for a moment, almost like surprise at himself. Then it closed over. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice held. She was proud of that, in the distant way you're proud of things that cost you. "Kayla, you need to leave right now." He left. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after she heard the door close. Long enough for her legs to start shaking. Long enough for the specific flatness that came after these moments to settle over everything and make the room look slightly too bright. She looked at her arm. There would be bruising by tomorrow. She picked up her phone. She stood there in her kitchen holding it with 2 hands the way you hold something you're not certain of. and she thought about what Petra had said. He'll find out. People like him always do. And she thought about what Dante Ravenna had said in that conference room, looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. His name. She pulled up the contact Petra had put in her phone during orientation. For emergencies, Petra had said, and then had given her a look that meant, I'll decide if it's an emergency. Don't abuse this. And she stood there for a long moment on the edge of something she couldn't clearly see the other side of. Then the window above the kitchen sink lit up briefly with the sweep of headlights from the street below. She went to the window. The gray Porsche was still parked across the street. Richard was sitting inside it, window up this time, the interior dark. Not leaving, just sitting there, watching her building. Her thumb found Petra's contact, moved past it, stopped on a number below it that had no name attached, just a single initial. D. She looked at that initial for a long moment. She looked out the window at the car. She pressed call. It rang once. Ms. Voss. His voice was the same at 10:47 on a Saturday night as it was at 7:55 on a Monday morning. Flat, controlled, completely awake. He's outside my building, she said. Her own voice surprised her. Steadier than she expected, as if the decision to call had used up whatever was left of the shaking. Right now. Sitting in his car watching my window. A pause. Not a long one. Don't turn the lights off, Dante said. Don't go to the window again. Pack a bag. Enough for a week. I'm not... She stopped. I don't need... Ms. Voss. She closed her eyes. Pack the bag, he said, and there was something in the flatness of his voice that wasn't cold, exactly. More like the opposite of cold. Something very controlled and very focused, the way a fire is focused when it's been contained to a single point. I'll have someone there in 20 minutes. The call ended. Kayla stood in her kitchen with the phone against her chest and looked at the ceiling and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She moved to the bedroom and pulled a duffel bag from the top shelf of her closet and started packing with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands knew what to do, even when their mind was still catching up. Clothes for a week. Her laptop. The folder in the nightstand drawer. Birth certificate, social security card, the lease agreement she'd need if things escalated to the kind of legal territory she'd been trying not to think about. Her medication. The charger. The small amount of cash she kept folded in the inside pocket of her winter coat, a habit she'd developed without consciously deciding to develop it. She did not go back to the kitchen window. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited. 18 minutes later, her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. Black Suburban at the north end of your block, a man's voice said. Come out the side entrance if there is one. There was. The building had a service exit through the laundry room. She'd identified it on her second day in the apartment 3 years ago for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself at the time. She went through it. The Suburban was exactly where the voice had said. The man behind the wheel was large and unhurried and didn't ask her any questions. He took her bag and put it in the back and drove her across the city through the wet streets without speaking, and she sat in the passenger seat watching the lights blur in the rain-covered window and tried to locate some feeling about what she was doing that wasn't just the hollow ringing of a decision already made. They didn't take her to Blackthorn Tower. They took her to an apartment building 15 minutes northeast. Residential, no signage, a lobby with a keycard entry, and no doorman. She was brought to the 11th floor and shown into an apartment that was clean and furnished with the anonymous precision of a place no one actually lived in. A bedroom, a kitchen, a living area with blackout curtains already drawn, towels on the bathroom counter, still in their packaging. Mr. Ravenna will contact you in the morning, the driver said. Then he was gone. She stood in the center of the living room with her duffel bag on the floor and the specific silence of an unfamiliar place pressing in from every direction. She sat down on the couch. She didn't sleep that night. He came at 7:15, which felt deliberately early, not punishingly so, but early enough to signal that her schedule was no longer entirely her own. He was already in a suit, which meant he'd been working for hours before this. He came in without knocking, which registered as a choice rather than carelessness, and he sat in the chair across from the couch where she was still sitting with her third cup of instant coffee and the dark circles that 11 weeks of bad sleep had been building toward for longer than this week alone. He looked at her without greeting and said, "Tell me what happened." She told him. She kept it precise and sequential because that was the only way she knew how to tell things without falling into the parts she didn't want to examine in front of him. She told him about the car, about the apartment, about the grip on her arm. She told him about the 40 minutes and the transition from careful to not careful and the particular quiet that had come over Richard's voice before he'd grabbed her. Dante listened without interrupting. His face did nothing visible. When she finished, he said, "This has been going on for 3 years." "Yes? And before that?" She looked at him. "My stepfather." She paused. "I left when I was 18. I thought I'd learned how to choose differently." She heard how that sounded and kept her face level. Apparently the curriculum was incomplete. He didn't respond to that immediately. He was looking at her in the same calculating way he'd looked at her in the conference room. The kind of attention that had nothing sentimental in it, which she'd come to understand was somehow more respectful than sympathy would have been. "Keller Group Holdings," he said. "What do you know about it?" "Real estate development, commercial and residential. He has contracts with 4 city departments, infrastructure, housing, 2 others I don't remember. He donates to political campaigns. He has a lawyer on retainer who I've heard him mention by phone, but whose name I don't know." She paused. "He's careful about what he says in front of me. He was careful from the beginning." She thought about that. "I think I understood that and told myself it was privacy." Dante nodded. "It's more than real estate." Something in the way he said it made her go still. "How much more?" she said. He stood and moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the drawn curtains the way he sometimes looked at windows when there was nothing to see through them, as if he was looking at something on the inside of the glass. "I've had people looking at him since Monday," he said. Monday. 4 days ago. The first day she'd started work, the day she'd given him a name she'd immediately regretted. "What did they find?" she said. He turned around. "How many women lived with Keller before you?" She blinked at the turn. Two, that I know of. He mentioned them in passing. One was a long relationship, a few years. The other was shorter. He said they both—" She stopped. "Left," Dante said. "Yes." "They didn't leave." His voice was the same temperature it always was, which was somehow worse. "The first one left the city entirely. She's living in another state. She has a protective order that's been renewed twice, and she gave a statement to a federal investigator 8 months ago that is currently sitting in a case file that has been delayed, administratively, for 8 months. He paused. The second one filed a police report 14 months ago that was closed within 6 days. The detective who closed it is on Keller's donor list through a pack that traces back 3 shell companies. The coffee cup was in her hands. She became aware of it. She set it down carefully on the table beside the couch because she didn't trust what her hands were doing. "The federal case," she said. "What is it?" "Trafficking, financial facilitation, blackmail. He collects evidence on powerful people and uses it to protect his construction contracts and his political cover. Some of the people he's blackmailing are the same officials who've been slow-walking the investigation." He looked at her directly. "He's been doing it for at least 12 years. The real estate operation is legitimate enough to sustain the rest. The rest is what actually runs the city from underneath." She sat very still. She was thinking about Richard's apartment, the room he kept locked that she'd told herself was a home office because he was a man who worked long hours and needed privacy. She was thinking about the phone conversations she'd half heard and told herself not to interpret. She was thinking about the way he'd gone still when she'd mentioned her accounting background during their second date, a particular quality of attention that she'd read as interest and was now revising. "How long has he known what I do professionally?" she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Dante's expression shifted, just slightly, not softening, focusing. "We believe he targeted you specifically." The word landed at the bottom of something. "Specifically," she repeated. "An accountant with no family connections, no social presence, a history of abuse that made you unlikely to go to law enforcement, and an obvious financial vulnerability." He paused. "You fit a profile he's used before. Someone he could keep close, watch for useful financial information, and control through the established pattern." He stopped. I'm telling you this because you need to know the shape of what you're in, not to... Stop. She held up her hand. Her chest felt like something was tightening inside it. Just give me a second. He stopped. She sat there and breathed. In for 4. She lost count. She tried again. 3 years. She had spent 3 years inside something she'd read entirely wrong. She'd been ashamed of herself for staying. She'd constructed elaborate internal narratives about complexity and history and the difficulty of leaving situations that people on the outside make sound simple. She'd told herself it was her failure of judgment, her failure of nerve, her failure. It had also been a construction, a deliberate one. She had been chosen the way you choose a tool. She became aware of a sensation in her face that she recognized as the approach of something she didn't want to do in front of this man. She locked it down. Hard. She was good at that. What does this mean for the federal case? She said. It means you're potentially a material witness, Dante said. It means Keller is aware of that possibility, which is why he's been escalating. He's not losing control. He's trying to reassert it before the case moves. You think he knows the case is moving? I think he has enough people inside the relevant offices to know when the wind shifts. He paused. Which means the 8 months of administrative delay may be ending. She looked at him. And you? Where do you fit into this? The question sat between them for a moment. Keller has been trying to acquire permits for a development on Vantage Street, Dante said. Property that is currently under a holding agreement with one of my companies. He has been using his political connections to block my Meridian project as leverage to force a sale. He paused. I was already looking at him before you walked into that conference room. She absorbed that. So I'm useful to you, she said. Not an accusation, just geography. Yes. She'd expected deflection. The directness of it landed differently. And the protection, she said. This apartment, the people outside. Also, yes. Both things are true at the same time. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. She looked at him for a long moment. She was very tired. The specific tiredness of someone who'd been running an internal calculation for years and had just found out several of the input values were wrong. What do you need from me? She said. Time. Stay here, stay off your phone, stay away from your apartment. Give me 72 hours. And then I'll know enough to move. She nodded slowly. He moved toward the door. Ravenna. He stopped. The detective who closed the report, she said. The one on Keller's donor list. Moretti. 11th Precinct. He came to the apartment once, about 8 months ago. Richard introduced him as an old friend. She paused. I thought it was strange at the time. He looked at me the same way Richard looks at things he owns. Dante stood with his hand on the doorframe. His back was to her, and she couldn't read his face. Thank you, he said. Then he left. She sat in the empty apartment and listened to the city outside the drawn curtains, and thought about a locked door in a luxury apartment, and all the things she'd told herself she wasn't seeing. Well, the 72 hours lasted 41. She knew something had shifted when the man outside her door, a quiet, heavyset man named Cole, who brought her coffee at 8 each morning without being asked, was replaced suddenly at noon on the second day by 2 men she hadn't seen before. They didn't explain the change. They were polite and positioned outside her door in a way that had nothing casual in it. At 2:15, Petra called. There's been a development, Petra said, and her voice had the particular controlled quality that meant the development was significant. I'm sending a car. Be ready in 10 minutes. What kind of development? Not over the phone. The car took her to Blackthorn Tower. Not to her office, to a floor she hadn't been on before, 2 below the executive level, which held a room she hadn't known existed, a long space with no windows and several monitors along one wall showing camera feeds from locations she didn't immediately recognize. 4 of Dante's people were in the room. Petra was in the room. Dante was standing in front of the monitors with his arms crossed and his back to the door when she came in. He turned around. His face told her nothing. It never told her anything. But Petra was standing with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and Petra's face was less practiced. Sit down, Dante said. She sat. Keller moved faster than we anticipated, he said. He filed a civil harassment complaint against you this morning. alleges that you've been contacting him compulsively and making threats, that he has a history of documented attempts to end the relationship, and that last Saturday night you came to his residence uninvited, and that's not what happened. Her voice came out hard and flat. He came to my building. He was in my apartment. I know. I have the texts. I know. He held up a hand, not to silence her, to slow her down. The complaint is a mechanism. It puts your credibility under formal legal pressure before the federal case can use you as a witness. If you go on record, Keller's legal team uses the complaint to argue you have a vendetta. It poisons the testimony before it can be given. She sat very still. He has a recording, Dante said, of the conversation in your apartment on Saturday. He's produced it as evidence in the complaint filing. It's been edited. She looked at him. How edited? Petra answered that one. Your voice says at various points that you've been watching his office, that you found out where he keeps financial records, that you intend to cause him professional harm. She paused. Those sentences exist in the original recording. They've been removed from context and sequenced to create a different conversation than the one that occurred. Kayla sat back in her chair. She thought about the apartment. She thought about the specific things she'd said in that room, fragments that existed, that she had said, that had meant entirely different things in the context they'd been ripped from. She was an accountant. She understood the work of extracting numbers from a spreadsheet and presenting them in an order that told whatever story you needed them to tell. Richard had been recording her in her own apartment. For how long, she didn't know. Long enough to have assembled material. Long enough to have built a second version of the story in case he ever needed it. I'm going to be sick, she said, and she meant it biochemically. Her stomach had clenched into something that made the room tilt slightly. But she breathed through it and stayed upright and fixed her eyes on the middle distance until it passed. The complaint has also been copied to Ravenna Holdings' legal department, Petra said. It alleges that this company facilitated your harassment campaign. It's a secondary pressure. Keller is betting that a liability threat will cause us to terminate your employment and remove our resources from your situation. She looked at Dante. Will it? No. She held his gaze. Why not? He was quiet for a moment, then, because I said no. It was such a flat, simple answer that it took her a second to process it as an answer at all. No corporate calculation, no legal reasoning, no condition, just no, and the particular quality of certainty that meant the conversation was over on that point. What do we do? She said. We have 48 hours before the complaint creates a formal hearing, Dante said. In that window, I need you to reconstruct every conversation, every meeting, every location you visited with Keller in the last 6 months. Dates, times, anything you can remember. We're looking for anything that corroborates the federal investigator's file, transactions, names, locations he mentioned. I've spent 3 years not paying attention to those things intentionally, she said. You're an accountant, Dante said. You paid attention. You just didn't let yourself use it. That landed somewhere uncomfortable. There's something else, Petra said. She and Dante exchanged a brief look, the kind of look that had information in it that she wasn't yet part of. The federal investigator on the trafficking case, the one whose file has been sitting for 8 months. Yes. Her name is Vance. She contacted us this morning. She's been watching Keller's recent legal filings. The harassment complaint activated something on her end. She believes he's moving to eliminate exposure, which means he may accelerate. Petra paused. She wants to meet with you directly, today. Kayla processed that. She wants my testimony. She wants whatever you can give her. She also... Petra stopped. Say it. She said to tell you that the previous complainant, the first woman, the one in the other state, attempted to retract her statement 6 weeks ago. Under pressure from Keller's legal team, she held. But the investigator is concerned about timeline. Kayla looked at the monitors along the wall. Several of the camera feeds showed streets she didn't recognize. One of them showed the exterior of a building she did recognize. The Keller Group Holdings headquarters, 3 miles from where she was sitting. On the feed, 2 men were getting out of a black car in front of the building. She didn't recognize them. Dante did. She could see it in the slight change of his posture when his gaze moved to that monitor. Who are they? She said. A pause. They work for a man named Braca, Dante said carefully. He handles... He stopped. Started again. Keller has been using outside resources for the situations he can't manage through legal or financial means. She understood what outside resources meant. She'd worked in this building long enough to understand the vocabulary. He hired someone, she said. He's done it before, Dante said. The second complainant, the retracted police report, the detective who closed the file, that wasn't just money. Someone spoke to him directly. She looked at Dante. Something cold had moved through her chest and settled there. He's not trying to discredit me, she said slowly. The harassment complaint, the edited recording, that's not the primary move. Dante's jaw tightened slightly. That was all. Those are cover, she said. If something happens to me, he wants a paper trail that makes it look like I was unstable, like I escalated, like whatever happens next was, Ms. Voss, his voice was very quiet, was coming. The room was very still. She sat in that stillness and felt something she hadn't felt before in this situation. Not fear, exactly, because fear had been the baseline for so long that she'd stopped registering it as information. This was different. This was the specific sensation of understanding the actual size of the thing you were inside, having spent years believing you were inside something much smaller. She'd thought she was in a bad relationship. She was in a machine. She looked at Dante Ravenna, who ran his own machine, who had brought her into the proximity of his for reasons that were partly tactical and partly, she believed, though she couldn't prove it, something else that he hadn't named and probably wouldn't. I'll meet with Vance, she said. Today, she paused. And I'll give you everything I remember. Every name, every number, every conversation I've been pretending not to understand for 3 years. She felt something settle in her chest that was not comfort and not peace, but was possibly the first genuine decision she'd made in a very long time. But I need you to understand something. He waited. I'm not doing this because you're protecting me, she said. I'm doing this because I let this go on long enough, and there are other women inside whatever this is, and the one in the other state held her statement when Keller's lawyers leaned on her, and I am not going to be the reason this case... The sentence finished itself in the silence of that windowless room. Dante looked at her for a moment that had a particular weight to it. Then he nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when she'd given him Richard's name, the acknowledgement of something confirmed rather than something new. Then we start now, he said. Investigator Vance arrived at 4. She was compact and sharp-featured, late 40s, with the kind of face that had learned not to show what it was calculating. She shook Kayla's hand without warmth and without coldness, the handshake of someone for whom every interaction was an instrument. She set a recorder on the table and a legal pad beside it, and looked at Kayla with the flat, patient attention of someone who had done this many times, and understood that the quality of what came next depended entirely on what happened in the first 60 seconds. I'm going to ask you things that will be uncomfortable, Vance said. I need you to answer them the way they happened, not the way you wish they had. Can you do that? Yes, Kayla said. They talked for 2 hours and 19 minutes. Chet. She did not sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness. Not the dull, anxious circling she'd lived with for years, but something more active, more purposeful. Her mind moving through names and dates and half-remembered conversations with the focused energy of someone finally allowed to use what they'd been carrying. By morning, she had filled 11 pages of a legal pad. By the time Dante arrived at 7, she had coffee ready and the pages organized by date, and she handed them to him without preamble and watched him read through them standing at the kitchen counter with the focused attention he brought to everything, and when he looked up, his expression had shifted slightly in a way she was beginning to learn to read. The storage facility, he said, on Merchant Road. He mentioned it twice, once on the phone, once in passing when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I don't know what it is. I do, Dante said, and left it there. She didn't ask. She was learning the shape of what he shared and what he held, and she was learning that the held things weren't withheld out of disrespect, but out of a specific operational logic she didn't need to understand entirely to work within. That was the last quiet morning for a long time. No, everything broke on a Thursday. She was at her desk in Blackthorn Tower. Dante had decided the safest place for her was inside his operation rather than in the anonymous apartment, a decision she suspected had more to do with proximity than comfort. When Cole appeared in her doorway at 11:43 with an expression that had abandoned its usual neutrality. "There's a situation," he said. The situation was this. Two of Dante's men, sent to conduct surveillance on the Merchant Road storage facility the previous night, had not reported in at their scheduled time. One of them had sent a single text at 2:17 in the morning, the word "Braca," and then gone silent. She heard this standing in a hallway with Cole and Petra and two other men she knew by sight, but not name, and she understood from the quality of the silence around her that this was serious in a way that superseded the categories she'd been operating in. She went back to her desk. She kept working. Her hands were steady. An hour later, Dante came out of his office and walked past her glass wall and looked at her briefly as he passed. The look contained information she couldn't fully read. She stood and followed him. He didn't stop her. They went down 2 floors to the monitor room. The camera feed on the Keller Group Holdings exterior showed nothing unusual. 3 other feeds showed locations she recognized now. The storage facility on Merchant Road, Keller's residential building, the 11th precinct where Detective Moretti worked. On the Merchant Road feed, a dark building, a parking lot, no movement. "Braca," Dante said to the room, and one of the men at the monitors pulled up a different screen. A photograph. A man in his 50s with a broad, unremarkable face, the kind of face that belonged to nobody's memory. Braca. The name Dante had said carefully 2 days ago when she'd asked about outside resources. "He's been in the city since Tuesday," the man at the monitors said. "He checked into a hotel on the east side under a cover identity we have on file from a previous operation. He checked out this morning." "He checked out," Dante repeated, "at 6:42. Dante was quiet. His hands were at his sides. She was standing close enough to see the particular stillness that had come over him, not the coiled stillness of the conference room, but something colder, more deliberate. "Pull everyone from secondary positions," he said. "Concentrate on Keller's primary locations. I want eyes on Vance." "Vance? She met with us. Keller knows she met with us. Pull eyes on her." The man at the monitors moved fast. Kayla stood slightly behind Dante and said nothing, and watched the screens and understood, with a clarity that had the specific quality of things you know but spend a long time refusing to apply, that the window she'd had, the careful, managed window of statements and legal pads and administrative processes, was closing. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An unknown number. A text. "I have something you need to see. The facility on Merchant Road. Come alone or I send what I have to Keller's lawyers tonight. You have 1 hour." She looked at the text for a long moment. Then she handed the phone to Dante without a word. He read it. His face did nothing. He handed it back and turned to the room and said, "Trace the number." "Already running," someone said. 30 seconds. "Burner, activated this morning. Can't get a tower location, he's moving." Dante turned to her. "You're not going." "I know." "Good." She looked at the phone. "But someone knows about the facility, and whatever they have, if it reaches Keller's lawyers before Vance can file, the complaint hearing gets complicated. Vance said 48 hours. We're at 31. Dante was already moving. He spoke to Cole in a low voice she couldn't fully hear. Cole left immediately. He spoke to one of the other men, who went to a cabinet along the wall and opened it. She stayed where she was. This was the part she'd been in before. The part where other people moved around her making decisions she wasn't part of, where she was the subject rather than the agent. She'd spent 3 years in that position. She recognized the specific texture of it. She picked up her legal pad. "The storage facility," she said. "Keller mentioned it in the context of the Eastport deal. He said the documentation was somewhere safe. He was on the phone. He thought I was in the other room." She paused. "He said the unit has everything, and then he said a number. I wrote it in my notes because I wrote everything. Page 7. Dante stopped. She found page 7 and held it up. The number was there, circled because she'd known she didn't understand it at the time, and had flagged it for later understanding. Unit 4, North 11. Dante looked at it. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. Page 7, he said. I told you I paid attention, she said. I just didn't let myself use it. He took the pad, handed it to the man at the cabinet, said 3 words she didn't catch. The man took the pad and left the room at a pace that stopped just short of running. And then everything accelerated. Well, the next 4 hours were the longest of her life, and she spent most of them in the monitor room watching screens and drinking coffee that someone kept replacing without her asking and saying nothing, while Dante's operation moved around her with the focused, unhurried speed of something that had been prepared for exactly this kind of escalation. At 2:14, one of the monitors flickered and a new feed appeared. Interior, industrial, the amber light of a storage facility corridor. Unit 4 North 11 was in the frame. The door was intact. At 2:41, 2 of Dante's men made entry. She watched the feed. Her coffee was cold in her hand. The unit held 12 filing boxes, 3 external hard drives, and a laptop in a waterproof case. It also held a man, late 30s, zip-tied to a chair, alive but in poor condition, who turned out to be an accountant named DeLuca, who had worked for Keller Group Holdings' financial division for 6 years, and had, in that time, developed an extremely detailed record of transactions he'd been instructed to process and had been too frightened to do anything with until 7 days ago, when he tried to contact the federal investigation and found his communications were being monitored. DeLuca was the one who had sent the text. Not to expose her. To find someone with access to Dante Ravenna. He'd gambled, apparently, that the new hire at Ravenna Holdings who'd appeared in Keller's security alerts was a more viable conduit than any law enforcement channel Keller hadn't already compromised. She absorbed that information sitting in the monitor room and thought about the particular irony of being useful because you'd been targeted. She didn't say that out loud. At 3:50, Vance called. Her voice had a contained urgency that communicated volumes. The filing from DeLuca's documentation, rushed through a federal channel that Dante's people had apparently had access to through means she wasn't going to ask about, had been sufficient to trigger a warrant. Keller's primary residence and office, Vance said, and Kayla was close enough to Dante to hear this through his phone. We execute tonight. Braca, Dante said. A pause. We have a location. East Side Hotel. He checked back in 40 minutes ago under a different cover. He's not done. I know that. The warrant execution needs to happen before he knows it's moving. Mr. Ravenna, I've been working this case for 8 months. I understand the timing. Dante said nothing. We go at 8, Vance said. Keep your people clear of the perimeter. She ended the call. Dante stood with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he looked across the room at Cole and said something in a voice too low to carry, and Cole's expression did something careful and confirming, and she understood that Dante's people would not, in fact, be clear of the perimeter. She understood also that this was not something she was going to argue about. The afternoon moved like something with weight behind it. She ate something, she didn't remember what, and changed into clothes Petra had brought from a bag she hadn't packed herself. And she sat with her legal pad and went through it again, looking for anything she'd missed. And at 6:45, Dante came and stood in the doorway of the small room they'd moved her to and looked at her with the particular attention she had come to understand as his version of checking in. You should stay here, he said. I know. Cole will be with you. I know. He started to turn. Ravenna. He stopped. She looked at him. There were things she could have said, and she sorted through them with the speed of someone who'd learned to edit on the move, and she settled on the one that was the most true and the most direct. Come back, she said. It was a plain, undecorated sentence. It didn't ask for anything she hadn't earned the right to ask for, and it didn't promise anything she couldn't keep. He held her gaze for a moment, then he left. The building on Hartwell Street, Keller's unfinished luxury skyscraper, 41 floors of exposed concrete and open elevator shafts and steel beams that hadn't yet been clad in anything, the flagship development of a man who had spent decades building the visible and hiding the rest, had been locked down for inspection since Tuesday, officially on a permit issue. The lockdown was, they would all understand later, Keller's contingency. A place already cleared of workers. a place with controlled entry points, a place chosen. Dante knew all of this before he entered. He'd been in situations that were traps before. The correction was not to avoid them, but to know their shape well enough to move through them faster than whoever had set them expected. He went in from the north side at 7:53 with 4 men ahead of Vance's warrant execution, because 8 months of administrative delay had taught him something about the value of arriving before the official version of events began. The lower floors were empty, concrete floors, plastic sheeting over window openings, the smell of fresh construction and standing water from Tuesday's rain. He moved with the ease of someone who'd spent enough time in difficult buildings to have internalized their logic. Stay away from the elevator shafts, use the stairwells on the outer walls, keep a man on each angle. Keller was on the 32nd floor. He didn't know this yet, but he was moving that direction with the instinct of someone who understood that the man running had chosen to run up rather than out, and that meant he believed height was still an advantage. The stairwell was dark, emergency lighting only, amber strips along the floor edge, enough to see the next step, not enough to see what was waiting at the landing above. He heard Braca before he saw him, a foot on concrete, the specific sound of a man adjusting his weight. Dante stopped, pressed himself against the wall, held up a fist, and the men behind him went still. 8 seconds of silence. Then a shot cracked down the stairwell from somewhere above. Not at him, angled wrong, a warning or a miscalculation, and the sound in the enclosed concrete space was enormous. A physical thing, and he was already moving before the echo had finished, up and around the landing with the geometry of it mapped in his head, the angle of the shot placing the shooter on the next half landing. Braca was large and had chosen his position well, and he was not by any measure a man who made many mistakes. But he'd anticipated a slower approach, and he was still adjusting when Dante came around the landing at the wrong height, lower than expected, under the second shot, and covered the distance between them in the time it took the sound to reach the floors below. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not something he would describe in detail to anyone later, including Kayla. It was the kind of 40 seconds that existed outside the version of events he offered up for other people. The version he kept for himself was simpler. Braca went down. Dante continued up. He was bleeding from the left forearm where the edge of something, the wall, a piece of rebar, had caught him during the struggle, and he pressed his right hand against it and kept moving because the bleeding was manageable and the floor count wasn't. 32. The door to the 32nd floor was propped open. He stopped at the threshold. The floor was open plan. No interior walls yet, just columns and the outer concrete shell and the wide black rectangles of unglassed window openings with the city spread out beyond them, 32 floors of air between the building's edge and the street. Wind moved through the space with a low, directionless sound. The emergency lighting here was sparse. One working strip along the north wall, the rest dark. Keller was standing near the east-facing window opening. He was in a suit that had not started the evening looking the way it looked now. He was holding a phone in one hand and his other hand was at his side, and when he turned at the sound of the door, he moved with the specific quality of a man running the remaining options. There weren't many. Below, distantly, the sound of vehicle doors. Vance's people, arriving at the perimeter. Keller looked at Dante. "You're bleeding," he said. "Yes." "You're also not law enforcement." "Also, yes." Keller looked at the phone in his hand and then at the window opening and then back at Dante with the calculating attention of a man who had spent decades being the one who controlled the geometry of situations. "Whatever you think you have," Keller said, and his voice was the confident register, the public-facing one, the one she'd described to Dante with the phrase, the wide, easy smile. And hearing it in this context did something to the temperature in Dante's chest that he filed away for later. "Whatever Vance thinks she has, my legal team has been preparing for this for 8 months." "I know," Dante said. He moved into the floor slowly. "They've been preparing for the federal case. They haven't been preparing for what we pulled out of Unit 4 North 11 this afternoon." A pause. Something shifted in Keller's face. "DeLuca," Dante said. The shift went deeper. 6 years of his records, Dante said. He's a careful accountant, probably the most careful person you ever employed, which turned out to be a problem for you. He was still moving, slowly, keeping the column between himself and Keller's right hand. The trafficking accounts, the blackmail documentation, the shell company that pays Moretti. 12 years of it, organized by quarter. Keller's jaw worked. The Eastport deal, Dante continued, and he watched Keller's eyes move. The slight, involuntary track of someone hearing the specific thing they feared most. 3 women, brought through the port on Keller Group transport manifests, listed as materials. 2019. You used the development project as cover for the logistics. He stopped. That's the part Vance didn't have before today. That's the part that moves this from financial crime to something else entirely. The wind moved through the open windows. Keller looked at the phone in his hand. Don't, Dante said. Keller looked up. Whatever call you think you're making, Dante said, the people on the other end of it are currently being visited by federal agents. Moretti was picked up 40 minutes ago. Your legal team is going to be very busy with their own exposure before morning. He paused. There is no call to make. Keller stood at the edge of 32 floors of open air with the city spread out behind him, and the sound of law enforcement organizing itself far below, and Dante Ravenna standing 15 feet away in a dark concrete room, bleeding from the forearm, looking at him with the specific expression of a man who had decided how this ended and was simply waiting for the other person to understand it too. Keller's face did something she would never see. A collapse of the architecture that had been maintained for so long it had probably become indistinguishable from the real thing. The smile gone. The confidence gone. What was underneath was smaller than anyone who'd feared him would have expected, and uglier and more ordinary. He looked for a moment like exactly what he was, a man who had built everything he had on the assumption that the people beneath him would never find a way to... The phone dropped from Keller's hand. It hit the concrete floor and skittered toward the edge and stopped 3 inches from nothing. He looked at it. Then he looked at Dante. And something in the geometry of the room, the distance between him and the window, the distance between him and the only exit, the sound rising from the street below, settled into a configuration that even a man who'd spent 12 years believing consequences were for other people could not argue with. His shoulders dropped, not dramatically, not the way it happened in the stories people told afterward, with some visible breaking point, some moment of operatic collapse. Just a slow, quiet diminishment, like air leaving something that had been held too tight for too long. His chin came down. His hands went still at his sides. Dante watched him and did not move and did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that the room hadn't already said. Below, the sound of boots on concrete stairs. Many of them. Moving fast. Keller closed his eyes. When he opened them, Vance was standing in the doorway with 4 federal agents behind her and a warrant in her hand and the particular expression of someone who had been carrying a case for 8 months and had arrived at the weight of it, finally coming to rest. She looked at Dante, at his arm, at Keller standing at the window's edge. "Step away from the opening, Mr. Keller," she said. He did. He walked toward her with the automatic compliance of a man whose body had already understood what his mind was still catching up to, and when the agents moved to meet him, he didn't resist and he didn't speak, and he didn't look back at the window or the phone on the floor or Dante standing in the dark with blood drying on his forearm. He looked for one moment at nothing in particular. Then the cuffs went on and the moment ended in Richard Keller, real estate developer, philanthropist, donor to 7 city council campaigns, profiled twice in the city's Business Monthly, was walked toward the stairwell by federal agents who had been waiting 8 months for exactly this and were not going to lose another minute of it. Vance stayed. She and Dante stood in the empty floor with the wind coming through the open windows and the city below doing what the city always did, indifferent to the specific accounting happening above it. "Your people were supposed to stay clear of the perimeter," she said. "Braca is in the stairwell on 14, Dante said. "He's alive." A pause. "How alive?" "Enough for your purposes." She looked at his arm. "You need that looked at." "I'm aware." She looked at the phone on the floor near the window's edge. One of her agents bagged it. She looked at the city through the open concrete frame, the light spreading in every direction, the rain that had finally stopped somewhere in the last hour, leaving the air with the clean, stripped quality of something washed through. DeLuca's documentation, she said. The chain of custody is going to require some explanation. Petra will handle the explanation. Petra. A faint, dry quality entered Vance's voice. Of course. She looked at him. The Merchant Road facility. Your men were there before mine. My men found DeLuca alive, Dante said. That documentation is what gave you the warrant. That documentation also contains records of transactions that touch organizations I'm fairly certain you have an interest in. Dante said nothing. I'm going to need your cooperation on the full scope of this, Vance said. It wasn't a request and both of them knew it. Not just Keller, the broader network. Some of those blackmail files have names in them that I'll have Petra reach out Monday morning, Dante said. Whatever is useful to your case, you'll have. She looked at him for a moment with the measuring attention of someone deciding how much to trust what they'd just been offered. She'd been in this work long enough to know that useful cooperation from people like Dante Ravenna had its own geometry. It gave you what it wanted you to have, and what it wanted you to have was generally enough to close the case that needed closing, and what it kept was its own business. She was also pragmatic enough to understand that 8 months of institutional failure had been resolved in one afternoon by a man who operated entirely outside her institutional framework, and that the correct response to that was complex. Monday morning, she said. She left. Dante stood alone on the 32nd floor for a moment. He looked at the phone on the floor. Vance's agents had taken it. The floor was clear. He looked at the window, the city, the specific arrangement of lights that represented, from this height, the total geography of everything he ran and protected and carried. He pressed his hand against his forearm. Then he went downstairs. She heard the elevator before she saw him. Cole had kept her in the monitor room as instructed, and she'd watched the feeds with the focused attention of someone who couldn't do anything useful with what they were seeing, but couldn't look away either. She'd watched the exterior feeds show Vance's vehicles arrive. She'd watched one of Dante's men emerge from the north entrance and say something to Cole through an earpiece that made Cole's shoulders drop slightly with what she was learning to read as relief. She'd watched the timestamp on the monitor climb past 9:30, and she'd kept her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed the way she'd been taught. The elevator opened. He walked into the monitor room and she was already standing, and she looked at his arm and at his face, and at the state of the suit that had started the evening, looking like all his suits, precise, controlled, an argument made in fabric, and now looked like something that had been through exactly what it had been through. You're bleeding, she said. I've been informed. He moved to the table and sat down, which was not something she'd seen him do without purpose. He sat the way someone sits when their body has decided it's been reasonable long enough. He looked at the monitors and at the empty chair across from him and then at her. She went to the cabinet along the wall. She'd seen Cole take a first aid kit from it twice. She found it on the second shelf and brought it to the table and sat across from him and opened it without asking permission. He watched her. Keller, she said. In federal custody. Vance executed the warrant. She found gauze. Antiseptic. She looked at his forearm. The sleeve was already pushed up, which told her he'd assessed it himself. And the cut was long and had bled considerably, but wasn't deep enough to need more than she had in front of her. Braca, she said. Alive, also in custody. Moretti. Picked up before the building. He paused, watching her work. The detention happens fast once the warrant moves. Keller won't get a message out tonight. She pressed gauze against the cut and held it. He didn't flinch, which she'd expected, but he also didn't maintain the deliberate stillness she'd come to associate with him performing composure for a room. He was just still. The way things are still when they aren't performing anything. DeLuca, she said, medical tonight. He'll be able to give a full statement by tomorrow. She unrolled the medical tape. The other women, the ones in the federal file. Vance has been trying to locate 3 of them for the past 8 months. The documentation from the unit gives her the resources to move on that. He paused. It won't be clean or quick. These things aren't. I know. She cut the tape, pressed it down. Her hands were steady. She had noticed that about herself over the last few hours. The steadiness that had arrived at some point during the evening and hadn't left, the way something settles when you've stopped waiting for the bad thing and the bad thing has finally happened and you're still standing. She sat back. He looked at the bandaging, then at her. "You're steady," he said. "I know." She looked at her hands. "I don't know when that happened." He didn't answer that, but he didn't look away either. "The harassment complaint," she said. "Withdrawn," he said, "automatically, when the federal arrest supersedes it. The edited recording becomes evidence in his case, not yours." He paused. "Vance will need your original account of that conversation to establish what was removed." "I'll give it." She looked at the first aid kit, closed it. "The apartment, my apartment. You can go back whenever you want." She nodded slowly. She thought about that apartment, the tidy rooms, the window above the kitchen sink, the specific configuration of exits she'd mapped on her second day there 3 years ago. She thought about what it would feel like to walk back into those rooms now, with Keller's file in a federal evidence locker and Braca in a holding cell, and Moretti sitting in an interrogation room somewhere in the city, trying to calculate what he still had to trade. "I don't think I want to go back," she said. It came out quietly and without drama, the way things come out when you say them for the first time and find they're already true. He said nothing. "Not tonight," she clarified. "I might feel differently tomorrow. The apartment here is available as long as you need it." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not asking for more than tonight." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you, it's available." They sat for a moment in the quiet of the monitor room with the screens still running and the city visible on some of them, and the particular late-night stillness of a building that had been operating at maximum capacity for the last 12 hours and was now breathing out. She looked at him, at the suit, at the thing he was carrying in the set of his shoulders that wasn't quite tiredness and wasn't quite anything else she had a name for. "Why did you come?" she said. "To that building, tonight. It wasn't— Vance had the warrant. You didn't need to be there." He looked at the table, then at the monitors. "Braca," he said. "I needed Braca handled before he could move." "That's the operational reason," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." She didn't push it. She'd gotten, over the course of the last 10 days, a working understanding of the limits of what this man said out loud versus what he carried in the spaces between words. She was beginning to understand that the ratio was significant and that the spaces were not empty. She looked at the clock on the monitor. 10:48. 10 days ago, she had been standing in this building's lobby for the first time, damp from the rain, holding a softening folder, trying to remember what breathing was for. She thought about that woman, the one with the broken umbrella and the specific quality of careful invisibility that had been installed in her piece by piece over the better part of a decade. She wasn't that woman anymore. She didn't know entirely what she was instead. But the not knowing had a different quality than the not knowing she'd been living in before. It was open rather than enclosed, a field rather than a room. "I should sleep," she said. He stood. She stood. She picked up the first aid kit to return it to the cabinet, and he took it from her hand, not sharply, just efficiently, and put it away himself. They walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. The doors opened. She stepped in. He didn't. She looked at him. "Good night, Ms. Voss," he said. "Kayla," she said. "After everything, I think that's permissible." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. "Good night, Kayla." The doors closed. She rode up to the 11th floor and walked to the apartment and let herself in and stood in the center of the living room in the dark without turning on any lights and listened to the city outside the drawn curtains. She didn't do the breathing exercise. She didn't need to. 3 months moved the way months do when you're rebuilding something, not evenly, not without setbacks, but with the accumulating weight of small things done and stayed done. Keller's arraignment was covered in the city's papers with the careful, hedged language of reporting on a man who had significant resources and a legal team that was not going to make anything easy. But DeLuca's documentation was extensive, and the federal investigators were good at their work, and the shell companies began to unravel with the logic of things that were only ever designed to hold under light pressure. When one thread pulled, the structure showed itself. Moretti negotiated a plea that required his full testimony on the blackmail network. He was not the first to do so. Of the 6 officials whose names appeared in Keller's files, 4 cooperated before the end of the first month. The 5th held out until the second month and then didn't. The 6th was a city council member who retained a different legal team after a conversation with his wife, herself an attorney, who reviewed the evidence and gave him what Petra, hearing about it later, called the most efficiently delivered reality check in the history of the city's political class. The woman in the other state, the first complainant, the one who'd held her statement under pressure, was contacted by Vance in the second week. She'd been living with the retractable weight of what she'd witnessed for 3 years. When the evidence from the federal warrant reached her legal representative, she called Vance directly. She didn't retract. She expanded. 2 other women came forward in the second month, then 3 more. The pattern that emerged was not surprising to Vance, who had suspected its shape for 8 months. It was, however, larger than even she had estimated. The network of financial facilitation and coercion that Keller had built stretched across 4 cities in a period of 12 years and had, at its worst, involved the movement of people treated as variables in a logistical problem. The city began the particular slow work of confronting what it had allowed to exist beneath its surface. Kayla went back to her apartment in the second week. She packed the things she wanted, left the furniture, and moved into a place in a different neighborhood. Smaller, different light, a kitchen window that faced north instead of west. She didn't keep the habit of noting exits on the first day. She noted them on the second day and acknowledged to herself that this was not a habit she'd be leaving behind quickly, and that was fine. The habits that kept you safe didn't have to be comfortable to be worth keeping. She stayed at Ravenna Holdings. This was a decision she made slowly and without drama, examining it from multiple angles the way she examined most things. She was good at the work. The work was not entirely clean, and she knew that, and had decided to know it rather than know it in the blurred peripheral way she'd known difficult things before. She brought her accounting background to a division that was in the process of being restructured, and she found that the intelligence she'd spent 3 years letting Richard Keller take inventory of was, applied to her own purposes, considerable. Petra, 3 months in, offered her a title that came with significantly more responsibility and a salary number that required Kayla to sit quietly for a moment before responding. "You don't have to decide now," Petra said. "I'll take it," Kayla said. Petra's expression did the thing it sometimes did, the fractional adjustment that meant she'd been expecting a longer process. "That was fast." "I'm trying something new," Kayla said, knowing what I want and saying it directly. "How's that going?" "Faster," Kayla said, "and less comfortable. I'm told that ratio improves." Petra almost smiled. It was the closest to almost smiling she'd observed in 3 months of watching Petra's face. "Who told you that?" "I read it somewhere." She hadn't. She'd said it to herself one morning in her new apartment with the north-facing kitchen window, and then written it down because it seemed worth keeping. She was on the roof of Blackthorn Tower on the last evening of the 3rd month. This was not something she had planned or arranged. She'd found the access door at the end of an upper hallway while looking for a server room and had gone through it mostly to see what was on the other side, and what was on the other side was this: a wide, flat expanse of sealed concrete, exhaust units running at low intervals, and the city in every direction with the particular sharp clarity that came after good weather. She stood at the eastern edge and looked at it. The lights went a long way out, all the way to where the city lost definition and became suggestion, and then beyond that to where the sky came down and the 2 darknesses merged. She'd grown up in this city. She'd spent most of her adult life here. She'd spent a significant portion of that adult life looking at it from the level of the street with her eyes down. From up here, it was a different city. Not cleaner, not more honest, but visible. The whole shape of it at once. She heard the door behind her. She knew the sound of his footsteps. She'd been in proximity to them for 3 months, and she was a person who noticed things, and she turned around before he'd crossed half the distance. He stopped beside her. Not close, not distant. The measured space of 2 people who had been navigating their particular architecture for 3 months and had developed an instinct for what fit. He looked at the city. She looked at the city. Late, she said. There was a meeting. A pause. There's always a meeting. How was it? Productive. He said it the way he said most things, flat, precise, and she'd learned to hear the information that traveled in the flatness rather than in the words. They stood quietly for a moment. Vance called this afternoon, she said. I know. She called me first. The Eastport sentencing recommendation. Yes. The federal case had moved fast once it moved, faster than Vance had predicted, faster than Keller's legal team had been prepared for, because the documentation from the storage unit had not left much room for the usual negotiations. The sentencing recommendation was not lenient. The judge would make her own determination, but the recommendation was the kind of number that removed certain futures from the table permanently. She said to tell you the other case is moving, Kayla said. The one in the other city. The documentation from DeLuca's files opened a parallel investigation. She said... She paused, finding the exact phrasing she'd written down. The kind of information that the right people in the right offices hadn't been able to locate before is now in front of them. She seemed to feel that was significant. It is, Dante said. There are more people in those files, she said. People who were moved, people who... She stopped. Some of them are findable, Vance thinks. Some of them can come forward now that the network is exposed. He was quiet. She looked at his profile. The jaw, the scar, the dark eyes that were doing the thing they did when he was inside a calculation she couldn't see the edges of. That's not nothing, she said. What happened here? The way it happened. No, he said. It's not. I'm not saying it was clean, she said. I know what your involvement cost. I know what it looked like to Vance. I know what those conversations Monday morning were. She'd sat in on 2 of them, because Petra had said she should understand the nature of the cooperation she was working within. She had understood it. She had continued working within it. I'm saying the net result is not nothing. I know what you're saying. He looked at her. The city lights were enough to see by, out here, enough to see his face with the careful attention she'd developed for it. Is there a question in this? No, she said. I've been sitting with how I feel about the method, and I've arrived at a position. I'm telling you what the position is. Which is, she turned back to the city, that I'd rather be honest about the shape of things than comfortable with a version that doesn't fit. She paused. 3 years of the alternative was sufficient data. He was quiet. Then, you're different. She considered that. I know. From the woman who walked in here 10 days after you started, with a bag packed and 2 hands on her phone, and 3 years of someone else's construction around who she was. He said it without sentiment, the way he said most things, as information rather than judgment. That woman would have had a different answer. That woman was running the wrong calculations, Kayla said. She had the right data and the wrong variables. She looked at him. Someone told me that early on, that I paid attention. I just didn't let myself use it. I remember saying that. So do I. The city spread out below them. The exhaust units ran their low intervals. Somewhere in the middle distance, a siren moved and was absorbed into the general sound of the place doing its endless business. She thought about the first morning, the lobby, the marble floors and the men who hadn't smiled, and the elevator with Petra listing rules at the pace of someone who'd given up expecting them to stick. She thought about the conference room with 8 men and a dark table and a window full of rain. She thought about the carafe and the heat of the coffee and the specific sound the room made when it stopped. She thought about his hand at her collar, the bruise, the change in his face. Why did that matter to you? She said. Not the question she hadn't asked in the monitor room. That one she'd asked, and he'd answered in the oblique way he answered things. This was a different one. That first day. The bruise. Men in your position see... She stopped, choosing the next word carefully. Difficult things. Regularly. You could have looked away. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. I've looked away before, he said finally. Many times, in many situations. He looked at the city. I had a specific reason not to, that morning. What reason? Someone I knew, he said. Flat. Careful. A long time ago. A woman who was... in a situation she shouldn't have been in. And I was 23 years old, and I looked away because looking away was easier and because I told myself it wasn't my business. He paused. I've spent a significant amount of the subsequent years understanding what that decision cost. She looked at him. He was still looking at the city. His hands were in his pockets. His jaw had the set it got when he was carrying something he'd decided to carry without complaint. She didn't ask who the woman was. She didn't need to. The information was in the way he'd said it. Not with the particular grief of something unresolved, but with the settled weight of something you've paid for and absorbed and carry now as furniture rather than wound. You could have done it differently, she said. What you did for me, you could have handed it to Vance from the beginning and kept your distance. Yes. Why didn't you? He looked at her. The city light was even and unhurried on his face, and she saw in it, not for the first time, but with a clarity she hadn't had access to in the weeks of motion and fear and decision, the thing that had been behind his eyes from the beginning. Not warmth, not in the way warmth was usually deployed. Something older and more durable. Something that had been put through enough to know what it was. Because keeping my distance had a cost I'd already paid once, he said. She held his gaze. She thought about a woman she didn't know, years ago, in a situation she could map from the shape of the silence around it. She thought about a 23-year-old who had made the calculation that most people made and had then spent years understanding it. She thought about a coffee cup and a bruise and a room that had gone completely still. You could have told me that, she said. Early on. No, he said. I couldn't. She understood that too. There were things you didn't say until they'd been earned by enough time and enough truth passing between two people that the saying of them didn't cost more than it was worth. She turned back to the city. I took the position Petra offered, she said. I know, she told me. I'm going to use the accounting background to build something specific, she said, with the survivor resources. There are women in those files who are going to need employment, protection, a place to land that doesn't look like charity. She paused. I know how to build financial structures. I know how to make things that look like one thing serve as another thing underneath. She said it without irony. It turns out that skill is transferable. Something shifted in his expression. It was small and happened quickly, the way things moved in his face, but she caught it. It is, he said. I'll need resources. Talk to Petra. I already did. She said to talk to you. He looked at her. Monday morning, he said. Bring me a structure, numbers, timeline, what you need and what it produces. I'll have it ready. I know, he said. You're the most prepared person in this building. She almost said something to that. She looked at his face and saw the thing at the edge of his mouth that happened sometimes. Infrequent, contained, but there, and didn't say the thing she'd been about to say. They stood on the roof of Blackthorn Tower in the clean air of a city they both understood in full, with the lights going all the way to the edge of the visible world, and the particular silence that existed between two people who had stopped performing things for each other and found, on the other side of that, something that didn't require a name to have weight. She had walked into this building 10 weeks ago with a broken umbrella and a folder going soft at the edges, and 3 years of damage she'd gotten very good at carrying. She was still carrying some of it. She expected to carry some of it for a long time. The scars she'd accumulated were not the kind that vanished cleanly. They were the kind that faded slowly and left the skin in that place different from the skin around it, tougher and less elastic and more capable of knowing what it had been through. She had decided to know what she had been through. She had decided to use it. The city below was the same city it had always been. Not better, not cleaned of what it held in its underside, still running its old corruptions and its new ones, still containing the full range of what people did to each other and for each other in the dark. She understood that. She had stopped expecting the world to be different from what it was. She had started, instead, to ask what she could do inside what it was. That was not a small change. It was, in fact, the only change that mattered. She breathed in the cold air from the north. Let it out slow. Beside her, Dante Ravenna stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the city he ran and protected and carried, and she could see, in the peripheral stillness of him, that he was not entirely alone up here in the way he usually was. Neither was she. That was enough. That was, she thought, more than enough. The lights held, the city breathed, The wind moved across the roof in long, even passes that asked nothing of either of them, and they stood in it together, two people who had found each other at the intersection of damage and function and something that hadn't been named yet but was taking up space in the room regardless. She would go downstairs soon. There was work tomorrow and structure to draft, and 11 pages of notes that were the beginning of something. But for now the city was lit all the way to the edge of the sky, and she was standing in it with her eyes open, and that was where she chose to be.